Okay, I think it's time to begin. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third plenary of the conference. This session is entitled Language Assessment During a Pandemic, Creating and Managing Opportunities in a Time of Global Disruption. And the presenter is Dr. Jay Banerjee. Dr. Banerjee is the Director of Language at Trinity College, London. She is a language assessment professional and researcher, experienced in teaching the principles of language assessment, designing and evaluating language tests, and conducting research into testing and assessment issues. For several years, she has been on the membership committee of the European Association for Language Testing and Assessment, and is a co-organizer for an EALTA special interest group in the assessment of speaking. She is also the treasurer for the International Language Testing Association. Her research interests are in the areas of assessing language for specific purposes, writing assessment, standard setting, and test development and validation. Please join me, everyone, in welcoming Dr. Banerjee to the conference. Over to you, Jay.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I'm going to share my screen with you all. I hope you can see it. Jonathan, shout if you can't.
I can see it.
Perfect. Let me get it into presenter mode. Perfect. Well, thank you. Hello to everyone. I'm working across so many time zones. I'm not going to try and say good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I would like to thank the organizing committee for having invited me to give this talk, and frankly, for having chosen such a thought-provoking theme for this year's conference. And I've chosen to take this conference theme as the guiding frame for my talk and to reflect on 18 months in and out and in to lockdown. So I'd like to start with an outline to the talk, and this slide sort of offers how I propose to walk through my reflection. I'll begin by briefly talking about the change or changes that the pandemic brought about and hastened. This will introduce threads that I will return to as the talk progresses. I'll then turn to the theme of this year's conference, fairer, greener, stronger. I'll pick up on each of these descriptive claims in relation to language assessment, moving from the recent past through the present and into the future. I'll begin with greener, looking at how we may arguably have become more climate friendly as a result of the pandemic. And then I'll look at whether we've become or have future opportunities to become fairer. And here I'll use two case studies. I'll look at issues such as the test taker experience, test equivalence, test equity, and test access. And finally, I will ask, how are we stronger as a field? How have we become or have the potential to become stronger? So the Greek philosopher Heraclitus has said that change is the only constant in life. And this is really very true for the field of language testing, which has always been moving forward, both in theory and in practice. But the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated change in one particular area, how tests are made available and how they are delivered. Over the course of 2020, several assessment organizations launched at-home tests. Isbell and Kreml review 7 of these at-home tests, and they then reflect on several themes or considerations for test takers and users, such as technology, test security, and the validity of test scores. They take a cautious view of these at-home tests, but they note that despite their caution, these tests can sometimes be far more accessible to test takers who live a long distance away from official test centers. And they also acknowledge that we should prepare for the sorts of disruptions that we've seen in the last 18 months to recur in the future. The change is here to stay and to cycle back. So they looked at the very quick work that was done in 2020. The first issue of Language Assessment Quarterly in 2021 focused on the work done within English language tests for university admissions and university placement tests. And they focused on the impact of the pandemic on this assessment provision. And they looked at the delivery of several of these tests. Now, the papers that are in this special issue told stories of a range of different institutions and organizations, and they presented some really positive outcomes. The adapted designs worked well for both the institutions and for the test takers, but several challenges also emerged from the solutions that had been developed. The first was security challenges. How can you have confidence that the test taker is giving their performance unaided? Also, what are the ethics of remote proctoring? Second, internet speed and connectivity. How do you manage disruptions to the test-taking experience because of bandwidth or signal drops? And finally, access to a private space. We don't all live in a context where we can be in a quiet room by ourselves for the length of the test. Meanwhile, none of our other interests and concerns have gone away. A quick scan of the two main journals in the field, Language Testing and Language Assessment Quarterly, show a rich vein of papers around a very wide range of topics, like measurement models, approaches to scoring, multimodality, the assessment of specific test taker groups, exam policy, test use, and misuse. So the world marches on even while it changes. So this has been a period of intense activity and change, and has it created the conditions for our field to become fairer, greener, stronger? For the remainder of this talk, I'll look at each of these descriptors, starting with greener. So, are we greener? For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to define greener as climate friendly. Trinity College London, for whom I work, has for a number of years been thinking carefully about ways to reduce its carbon footprint, and the global pandemic has certainly done much to move us all into a more carbon neutral lifestyle. And in the last year, more and more language assessments have moved fully online. This has reduced the volume of paper-based tests that are printed and the impact of shipping those booklets to and from test centers. And where speaking exams are given face-to-face by a human examiner, examiners have not traveled, not internationally, not domestically. Indeed, many assessments have been taken at home. So the impact on the environment through the movement of people has been much reduced. And additionally, where test centers have still been able to operate, the center audits have been moved online. It's been possible to conduct unannounced audits by contacting a test center on the day and taking a video tour of their arrangements. This has been very effective, efficient, and climate friendly. But there have also been opportunities for more climate-friendly language assessment research. And I've actually already come across several examples in this conference of studies where data has been gathered remotely. And the two examples that I'd like to pick out for particular mention are linking studies and impact studies. Those of us who have conducted linking studies know that they are a scheduling challenge. You have to find a block of time where all the experts that you would like to invite are available, and then you have to bring them all to the same location. If the outcomes of remote linking studies can result in robust and defensible links. The climate benefits are real, and it's also possible to engage with experts on their schedule and to fit in with their availability. Harry Collias looked at these possibilities in his PhD research. He looked at the feasibility and appropriateness of setting cut scores in synchronous audio and audiovisual environments. And later today, you might wish to attend a talk by John Pill, Tineke Brunfo, and Luke Harding, because they've recently completed a test to scale linking project, and they've done it entirely online. And finally, I'd like to give an example from one of Trinity's other subject areas, its music qualifications. Shortly before the pandemic, Trinity launched a pilot project to introduce international music qualifications in Italy and a parallel impact study. The study was initially conceived as entirely in person, with in situ lesson observations and school visits. But in the last year, the project team has pivoted to using online video conference platforms. And this successful reframing of projects from in-person to online data collection shows how we can be more innovative in our approach to research and do our part to saving the planet. So are we greener? Currently, our activities are more climate friendly. And we're still finding ways to meet and to learn from one another at online conferences like this. But how long will that last once the pandemic fades? I know that our impulse to be in person, to do things in a physical rather than virtual space is very strong. I see it in the discourse of resistance to the constraints of the pandemic. So I would argue that we have some way to go yet. And what I'm about to say might sound a bit yoga inspired, but I think that it's a useful frame. We need to adopt a mindful approach to our use of resources in our assessment and our research activities. So I'd now like to turn our attention to the descriptor fairer. For the purposes of this talk, I will interpret fairer as access to an assessment opportunity, test taker experience, test equity, and test equivalence. And I'll explore these interpretations through two case studies, both of Trinity qualifications. One is GESI, a pair of variations on our standard GESI qualification, GESI Online and GESI Home, and the other is ESOL Skills for Life. And let's first look at GESI Online and GESI Home. I'd like to begin by giving a little bit of context. The GESI examination suite assesses communicative speaking and listening skills for use in real life, be that work, study, and leisure. The suite covers the Common European Framework of Reference language proficiency ranges pre-A1 to C2. And the lowest grades, grades 1 to 4, are typically taken in low stakes contexts and typically by younger learners, and they assess the pre-A1 to A2 levels. These learners are generally at an early stage of learning English, and the exams motivate the test takers to keep practicing their English skills. And they're traditionally delivered in person by a Trinity qualified examiner. And for these younger learners, the exam is an event. They've been studying English all year, and this is their opportunity to show a new person what they can do. And for the older learners that we work with, those who take the higher grades, the test offers access to educational opportunities. And the pandemic was a massive disappointment to both groups because many of them look forward to this milestone in achieving their educational goals. So the first thing that Trinity did at the start of the pandemic was to develop an online version of GESI. The test taker and the examiner are connected by video conference. And we benefited in doing this work from the excellent work that had already been done by Fumi Nakatsuhara, Chihiro Inoue, Vivian Berry, Evelina Golozzi, as well as from studies Trinity had conducted. And these guided us in the modifications we might need to make to the test to minimize delivery complexity, the training that examiners might need, and the support that we needed to give to test takers. And we carefully considered several delivery questions. The first was, where do test takers have guaranteed access to a stable internet connection? When we investigated this, we found that large pockets of our test takers live in small villages and towns where internet access was patchy. Several did not have good internet connections at home. The second question we asked was, who could we rely on to support the test takers when the exam was set up? And we also found that not all of our test takers lived in homes where they could rely on help from their parents. There were still parts of the world where people were not super comfortable with computers and digital devices. And our third question was, how might we ensure test security? The speed at which we were delivering this solution, we were not yet ready with measures that gave us confidence that we could maintain the security of the test in a home environment. So our answers to these questions led us to the decision that GESI Online would be available in test centers. And the hope at the time was that the pandemic would not persist for as long as it has. But lockdowns continued around the world and largely prevented children from accessing the exam. Also, language assessment wasn't the only field that was changing. Governments realized how important internet access was, as well as the need to provide children with digital devices to their lessons. Parents also learned and adapted, so the macro environment evolved through the 18 months. So Trinity therefore developed GESI Home, a home-based version of the online exam for GESI grades 1 to 4. This version of the exam assumed a stable internet connection in the home and the availability of an adult to confirm the test taker's identity and to help with test setup. All three GESI versions share the following features. There is a human examiner who interacts with the test taker, both eliciting language and participating in a discussion with them. The tasks are the same. The rating scale is the same. For each new version that we developed, we checked the equivalence of test scores, test taker and examiner perceptions, test taker and examiner language. This work was done by my colleague, Kathy Taylor. The development process was iterative, so at each phase, data was collected and analyzed. The aim was to ensure that the test taker experience was maintained across the three versions, as well as the stability of the exam results. Kathy's analysis of the trial data set shows that candidates have a high likelihood of getting the same result, regardless of the version they take. Her analysis also shows that both the test takers and the examiners enjoy and feel comfortable with the online and home versions of the exam. Her initial analysis of the examiner language further shows parity in the examiner's elicitation behavior across all three versions of the exam, and her analysis in this area is ongoing. The GESI Home version, however, introduced two new considerations that we had been able to assume with the center-based GESI Online. In the center-based version, test centers manage test administration and are always just outside the test room as chaperones. In a home-based environment, we wanted to put similar measures in place and explored two things: an online proctor to observe the conduct of the exam, and a chaperone in the room with the candidate, usually a parent. This was particularly important since the test takers were so young. We wanted to ensure that they felt supported during the exam. We conducted approximately 150 trials, and during the trial period, we conducted exam observations, we held interviews, and some interesting findings emerged. First, the presence of the proctor made the test takers and the examiners feel uncomfortable, like they were under surveillance. The examiners also argued that the proctors were duplicating the effort that they already make during the exam. Indeed, when we looked at what the proctors paid attention to for test security and what the examiners also noted, there was near complete overlap. Often the examiners noted more than the proctors because they were so engaged in the interaction. Furthermore, performing this dual role as examiner and proctor did not add to the cognitive load for the examiners or affect their scoring of the candidate. Arguably, this is because this has already always been part of their role. So Trinity decided that the examiner would occupy a dual role as examiner and proctor. They would carry out the initial room scan, and then during the test, they would pay attention for signs of test security breaches, such as help from an individual who was out of the camera's sightline. Then the chaperone. Our investigations into the presence of the chaperone also had some unexpected consequences. Despite the guidance that we provided, the chaperone's behavior was very variable. Some maintained the appropriate distance behind the test taker and remained still and unengaged. Others seemed very distractible, and they fidgeted and they looked at their phones. Still others touched the test taker, spoke to them, stroked their hair, and whispered. Interestingly, the kids didn't appear to lose concentration and seemed able to ignore the chaperone. However, the examiner, for whom the chaperone was always in sight, was often distracted by the chaperone's behavior. And this impacted their ability to conduct the exam to Trinity's usual standards. What this means is that even though the child did not appear to be affected by the presence of the chaperone, their test-taking experience was impacted because of the effect that the chaperone had on the examiner. As a result, Trinity decided that chaperones could be present in the room to complete the test taker check-in process and security check, but would subsequently leave the room so that both the examiner and the test taker could concentrate and be uninterrupted. So the case study of Jessie Online and Jessie Home has shown how Trinity, like many other organizations, has adapted to the pandemic. We've made every effort to remain fair. We've developed versions of Jessie that enable test takers to access the assessment and achieve their educational goals. Because we have these digital versions of the exam, we were able to offer an exam to a young person who was in hospital and still wanted to take it. We would not have been able to do so before the pandemic. We've also paid careful attention to the test taker experience, checking at every stage of the development process that the underlying test design is unaffected and that the test taker and examiner are comfortable. We've confirmed that the versions are equivalent in the results that test takers get, and we have preliminary results showing that the language in the exam is broadly similar. But are we fairer? Have these changes made us more inclusive? In some ways, yes. but there are more ways now that test takers can engage to achieve their goals. However, do these solutions work in every context? And I'd like to use the next case study to reflect on this. My first case study was about a test over which Trinity has a lot of control. However, this isn't always the case. And my next case study is of an exam where Trinity has to work within the boundaries of national education policy. And the name of this qualification is ESOL Skills for Life. As the name suggests, ESOL Skills for Life is a suite of exams that assesses English for speakers of other languages. It's designed specifically for adults who are newly arrived to and living in Britain, and who need English for everyday life, study, and employment. In essence, it is a qualification that enables access to life, community, and opportunities in the United Kingdom. The content of this suite of exams is based on the UK national standards for adult literacy and is closely aligned to the UK adult ESOL curriculum. As such, the Department of Education and the regulators for the countries that make up the United Kingdom have quite a lot of say in how the exam is to be managed. And throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, they've been particularly concerned about delays in student progression. If a student is unable to take an exam or be awarded a qualification, they cannot proceed to the next stage in their education. So that's potentially a huge disruption for huge swathes of candidates in Britain. Therefore, at various points in the pandemic, the England regulatory body, Ofqual, has released regulatory frameworks to govern how qualifications like ESOL Skills for Life can be awarded. Each of the regulatory frameworks had very long names and acronyms. They were a challenge, even for me, a Singaporean, well used to everything being contracted into a pithy acronym. So I won't give you the names of the frameworks. Instead, what I'll do is I'll focus on what we were required to do under each of them. For the first framework, we were required to offer centre-assessed grades. For the second, we had to offer adapted assessment. For the third, we had to offer teacher-assessed grades, essentially centre-assessed grades by another name. As you might imagine, the demands of each of these adjustments were very different. They involved different actors in the assessment process and presented tremendous challenges in guaranteeing equity in assessment outcomes. So let me look at each in a little more detail. Most of you have probably heard about centre-assessed grades. This was the process implemented for the 2020 GCSE and A-level results in Britain. In the case of ESOL Skills for Life, Trinity had to collect a centre-assessed grade for each student, as well as all the evidence that we needed to be confident that the result was justified. So we took the following approach. We provided each centre with a standardised data collection form that ensured that we received comparable data for each student. We stipulated the kinds of evidence we would accept as backing for a centre-assessed result. We implemented an approach to centre moderation that ensured that we moderated a representative sample of the centres. And the moderation entailed reviewing and evaluating the actual evidence for the centre-assessed grade. And then finally, we checked the profile of the scores against historical trends to ensure that the pattern of results in the summer of 2020 were in line with previous years. Through this painstaking and largely manual process, Trinity was able to release scores with some confidence that we had assured equity in the scores we issued, both between test centres and across time. However, things had not gone quite as smoothly for the A-level results, resulting in headlines like this. So a new regulatory framework was put in place that quietly laid down the option of centre-assessed grades. Under this new framework, we were expected to deliver exams as normal, as far as we possibly could, but we were also expected to deliver adaptations should students not be able to take the exams under normal testing conditions. So this presents a conundrum. ESOL Skills for Life exams are paper-based. The speaking and listening exams are conducted in person by a visiting examiner. We could see that this feature would be an impediment to delivering our tests. To ensure that we behaved fairly and equitably towards our examiners, we canvassed them for their views. And we found that most were still nervous about using public transport, so traveling to a test centre, and about delivering the exams in person. So just as with the GESE exam, we set about delivering or developing an online exam and an online version of the ESOL Skills for Life, speaking and listening. We could bring what we had learned from our work on GESE, but there were some differences that we had to look at in terms of the test taker population, and these presented new challenges. If I can remind you, the ESOL Skills for Life test taker is an adult who is newly arrived to Britain, and depending on where they have come from, they can vary tremendously in their literacy practices and with their familiarity with technology. So our solution had to be accessible to a much more varied type of test taker. A really helpful aspect of the adapted assessments framework is that it allowed Trinity to be the actors in the assessment process, gave us much more agency in guaranteeing equity in the assessment outcomes. So because of that variability in the test takers, we chose to make the online ESOL Skills for Life exams available only in test centres. And this enabled us to offer a much more coordinated support for both the test takers and the centres in terms of explanatory videos, practice opportunities, and digital resources. Once again, we ran a series of trials, and my colleague Vula Canistra analysed the data. As with the GESE analysis, we compared the results received by the test takers. We checked test taker perceptions of the online exam and conducted detailed analyses of the language that was produced. And the findings were very similar to the GESE and ESOL, between the GESE and the ESOL Skills for Life. And I'd like to draw your attention really to one interesting detail that Vula has noticed in the test taker language. What she found was that test takers appeared to have produced more fluent speech in the online version, but they also appear to have paused more frequently. And we believe that here we are seeing a difference between in-person and online communication that is entirely consistent with the context in which the language is being used. And these pauses appear to reflect the fact that in online chats and communication, there tends not to be as much overlapping speech. And as we all know, the coronavirus has not departed. So in early 2021, a resurgence of the virus resulted in college closures, and it became less certain that the assessments could proceed as planned, even the adapted assessments. We therefore had to implement a third regulatory framework. In this framework, we were required to offer teacher-assessed grades to test takers who were unable to attend a test centre. And once again, we were in a position where we had to work with different actors in the assessment process while still guaranteeing equity in the assessment outcomes. But this time we had learned from our earlier experience, and we were especially aware of the support that teachers need. So in addition to streamlining the process and making the data collection form much easier to complete, much more foolproof, we provided full sample tests in assessment packs and also gave several workshops to help teachers learn how to apply the ESOL Skills for Life assessment criteria and rating scale. Now, this was the third assessment framework in a 12-month period. Each of these frameworks and the requirements that came with them had been motivated by a desire to maintain students' access to opportunity and education. On our part, Trinity tried to ensure that we supported teachers and test takers through the process so that each test taker received a result that reflected true language proficiency. But are we fairer? The two case studies demonstrate our commitment to offering test access and also test equity and equivalence. It's a commitment that I've seen in the examples that I've read about in the literature from many other organizations. But are we really more fair as a result of the pandemic? Perhaps. We have, through our creativity or because national policy demanded it, developed a range of different ways in which we can offer access to exams and make sure the results are defensible. But are there groups that we're still excluding? Internet access is still not guaranteed, even in countries with developed infrastructure. Many families still share computer devices. Most people actually use mobile phones more than they use computers. And by far, the majority of our assessments, K through 12 and otherwise, are minimally tablet-based. There's also a whole group of learners who are not digital natives. And in our race to accommodate the majority, have we kept an eye on the needs of test takers who are neurodiverse or who have other needs? As we charge forward into this digital future, we must keep all of these things in mind. I'd now like to turn our attention to the descriptor stronger. How should we define stronger? I'd like to take a couple of perspectives, one in relation to resilience and the other in relation to the values that we commit ourselves to. I'd like to make the claim that the language assessment field has shown tremendous resilience over the last 18 months. There have been really interesting innovations in test design and delivery. The papers in the LAQ special issue give us an insight into just a slice of this work that has been going on in every teacher's classroom. This conference is testimony to the fact that we have adapted our research methods so we can still research and learn and explore. We're running focus groups online using Miro boards and other tools so that we can collaborate and also to gather data. All in all, there's a clear sense that we have made every effort to turn adversity into opportunity. But there's another way in which we can become stronger, which is the values that we commit to. Each of us will come to this differently, so I don't really want to dictate. Instead, I'd like to suggest a couple of areas that are important to me. The first of these falls under the broad umbrella of equality, diversity, and inclusion, but is more specifically about the accommodations that we provide to test takers who are neurodiverse or who have other needs. Every assessment organization has a set of approaches to offering accommodations in their tests. These can be additional time, an amanuensis, a screen reader. but we have much to learn about how to truly level the playing field for all our test takers so that they can demonstrate their language proficiency in a way that works for them. The second area that's important to me is our responsibility as language assessment professionals to make good tests, of course, but also to work with SCORE users so that they understand how those tests work and how to use and how not to use those tests. Here, I'm reminded of the really useful metaphor that Tony Green has used. He likens test development to manufacturing a car, one that is good quality and safe. He reminds us that once a car is purchased, driven off the lot, we cannot control how the driver uses the car, whether they drive at or above the speed limit, choose to take their sports car off-road where it's bound to become mired in mud. This is all true, but it leaves me wondering how we can build productive conversations with the drivers of our tests. So we come to the end. My conclusion is that we are indeed now greener, fairer, and stronger as a result of our experiences and work over the last 18 months. Our challenge now is to maintain our commitment to being more climate conscious in our activities and to resolving the inequities that might have crept in. And now is a very good time at the end of a calendar year to reflect on what our values are and what we want for our future. And I'd like to close by thanking the Trinity team in general, without whom the work that we've done over the last 18 months could not have happened, and in particular, Vula Canistra and Kathy Taylor. And all of you, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Banerjee, for that wonderfully insightful presentation. That brings us to the end of our third plenary session. Remember, you can carry on this conversation concerning this topic in the relevant plenary discussion room found in the community section of the platform. I hope you've all decided what sessions you'll be watching for the rest of the day. I have no personal favorites, but I'd certainly keep an eye on the eye tracking symposium later in the day. And if you haven't already done so yet, please cast your vote in our student awards, which will, the winners will be announced at our award ceremony later in the day. Have a good day and enjoy the rest of today's sessions. Goodbye.